Welcome, everyone, to Homeless in San Diego, Season 4. We are super fortunate to have senior investigative reporter with the Voice of San Diego, Lisa Halverstadt. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you. It's so great to be here, finally.
You're here where we started. So you're in the Voice of San Diego podcast studios where we started this show many years ago. I'm up at our Escondido headquarters now, but it's good to see the old studio digs still there, pumping out good material. So,
Yeah.
Lisa, you've been investigating homelessness. You are now, from my perspective, the most tenured and most knowledgeable local reporter on the issue. And you have so much to offer and share. We could frankly talk for hours and days and probably bore everyone to tears, but there's a lot that you and I have worked on together over the years that we're going to touch on today around a broken homeless system, around behavioral health needs, just around the challenges people face experiencing homelessness. So I'd like to just start by asking, you've been doing this a number of years. When somebody who isn't familiar with your work and doesn't understand the inside baseball of the homeless system and what's broken and what works well and what doesn't, when someone learns that you cover homelessness, what is it that you share that you think they don't understand, that you want to really speak to, or myths you want to dispel right away?
Oh, boy. Well, as you'd imagine, like every time that I do go to a party, and I'm sure this is the same for you, Greg, and people hear what work you do, you're going to get sidelined in a conversation for a while with a lot of
Yeah.
questions. I find I spend a lot of time really just talking about how everyone's situation is so different. And so a lot of times, there's conjecture about, everybody's got a mental illness, everybody has a substance use issue, you name it, everybody's coming from other places. And, I spend a lot of time explaining, like, most of the people that are on the street are from our communities in San Diego. And I often find myself also just talking about how hard it is to get help, even if you really want it. And also about, I would say, the thing that I've found that binds a lot of people together who fall into homelessness is that they don't have that backstop or that support. So there could be a lot of different things going on, lots of different pathways into homelessness. But the bottom line is, what this individual or family doesn't have, that other people have, is a landing space when they hit tragedy, and can be multiple different setbacks. They don't have a place where they could, maybe stay. Maybe, their parents or family isn't in town to have them stay. Maybe they had that for a while, but they've burned that. It's just that they don't have that support.
Is there a personal story that comes to mind, Lisa, that could illustrate that for our listeners?
Oh,
I know
man,
there's so
it's
many.
hard to pick
Yeah.
one in the moment. Oh gosh, I've met so many people over the years, and some people, I will say, I've met some people that are really wonderful people on the street who have been so helpful to me and what I'm trying to do, despite all that they have going on. One person that comes to mind often is a woman named Debbie. And I believe her family was elsewhere, and she just really struggled to make ends meet. She was actually extremely pivotal in my coverage of hepatitis A. To kind of speak to, because I think I want, as I get this or give this example, I want to talk about how these folks are contributing to their communities too, because I think that's often something that we don't talk enough about.
Yeah.
But Debbie was constantly keeping me updated on whether restrooms were open in East Village where she was staying. She would call me when they were doing cleanups. Maybe the city wasn't following all of the guidelines, including she was concerned at one point, were they letting debris go into a storm drain? You wouldn't think of that, maybe being a top of mind concern, but she really wanted me to know that they weren't following all the protocols from what she could tell. And she also introduced me to a friend who got hepatitis A, who I later visited in the hospital. So this is a person that had faced a lot of setbacks, but was still contributing.
It's a great example because I think a lot of people have misconceptions about individuals experiencing homelessness, and somebody who's a member of a community is maybe the first one, right? Thinking that just because somebody's without housing, they're not a part of any community. And there is an absolute community of people who are in that awful situation. You've had the opportunity to spend time with those individuals in ways that most people have not. And one of the challenges that you and I have spoken a lot about are just how difficult it is for people to get off the streets who want to change their situation, want to improve the situation, but there's no room at the inn. There may not be beds and shelters. There may not be treatment programs available if they have that as an issue. Um, we could go a lot of directions here. What area, when we look at the homeless system, do you think is important to share about, given all the important reporting you've done on this over the years?
Oh boy. I think that it's maybe the answer is that there's not just one area of the
Hmm.
system. It's multiple systems and how they do or don't work together, and different levels of care that can't succeed without the other. So, for example, there's been a lot more discussion, I would say, in the last year or so in San Diego about shelter access. So, 4 out of 5 referrals for shelter in the city of San Diego in the last 6 months of the year did not result in someone actually getting shelter. That's a pretty remarkable number. And we often hear, stories of people refusing shelter offers. I'm hearing a lot about people wanting those shelter
So,
opportunities.
so let me jump in. So 4 out of 5, sorry, 4 out of 5 referrals. What do you mean by that? Can you help our listeners understand, like, who's referring and what
Yeah.
that means?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. So basically, the San Diego Housing Commission, which runs most or operates or oversees most of the shelters in the city of San Diego, they get referrals from people like outreach workers, different homeless service providers, and even individuals themselves who may show up at the Homelessness Response Center or the Neil Good Day
Hmm.
Center in downtown San
Hmm.
Diego, saying that they want shelter. And so all of those referrals in a given day that everyone's making go into the system, and they figure out, okay, we've got X number of beds to provide. And then based on vulnerability and availability, those beds are doled out. So what's happening is a lot of people are requesting.
And so if there are 10 shelter referrals on average, 8 of those are not successful. 2 of those 10 are getting into shelter. Do you know what are the reasons that you're hearing as to why the 8 out of 10 are not successfully getting into shelter?
Well, there, for one, just are not enough beds to accommodate everyone who wants them. A lot of folks also, especially seniors or people with health conditions, need bottom bunks, and those are really tough to get,
Absolutely.
because they're only half the beds are bottom bunks, right? And then also say that you have a person who's in a special population, especially there's been a struggle for years in San Diego for access for women, even though, there are more men who experience homelessness in the city and county. We're seeing more women in need of shelter. And so I know the city has added some beds for women specifically to try to help address that.
When you said it right at the beginning of your answer, too, I don't want it to be lost. You talked about bunk beds. How many people listening to this show or just out in the community know that so many shelters rely on bunk beds, and lots of bunk beds in big open areas? And how many people who are listening to this would really love to give up wherever they're sleeping? And they may think it's great because they have a roof over their head. But if somebody is unsheltered and on the street, they probably have some place that they're sleeping at night. And as 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 dangerous and as many problems as that place may be, it can often be more comfortable or feel more safe than giving that up, going into an unknown situation, being with hundreds of people who they don't know in a large open warehouse type situation with lots of bunk beds, let alone if they don't have the ability to get up to a top bunk, just the environment that it creates. So I think it's important for us to talk about these challenges in really practical ways that help the public conceptualize just what it means to go from unsheltered into a shelter. And even when beds are available, there are a lot of legitimate reasons why somebody has who's on the streets has concerns about moving into that type of environment.
Well, and then let's talk about the path out of the shelter, because one of the challenges then is, okay, Greg, we've got you a bed. You have a bed in the shelter, but where are we going to be able to put you next? How are we going to help you get housing? And um, early last year, I had done a story on shelters in the city of San Diego, and I believe at the time I had found just 13% of people who were exiting the city's shelters overseen by the Housing Commission were actually getting permanent housing. And so I hear a lot, too, from people on the street who say, well, I've gone to a shelter before and it didn't land me anywhere else, or they didn't help me. Or people saying, well, if I go into a shelter and I give up these things that you're talking about, maybe they have a community. Like Debbie had a community in East Village that, was very supportive. Yeah. They looked out for each other. People have pets and other things that sometimes shelters can't accommodate. And you're going to leave this behind, that what you have, what you're grasping onto, to go into a place, and there's no guarantee in their view that that's going to get them into housing. And so it just creates more concern about whether that's the right option.
And so when we think about somebody who has gone from an unsheltered community into a large congregate shelter environment, often multiple times they've made that transition back and forth. And often when they're on the streets, they're experiencing violence, they're witnessing violence. There's a lot of drug use, whether they're using any substances or not. There's a lot of that out there. When we think about all that, it's no wonder that homelessness, it turns out, is really bad for your mental health, and that individuals' mental health, frankly, their sanity declines the longer they're homeless, and that creates additional issues and problems.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think I always try to bring up when we start talking about mental health and the homeless population is, imagine trying to sleep on the concrete every night with all of the chaos of the street, whether it's the people around you or just cars driving by. People are just, they can become paranoid about maybe somebody did attack them once, and so they're just very scared that could happen again. They never sleep well. And I think a lot about, I used to have a lot of conversations with homeless individuals about this early on when I was writing about homelessness. I had this period that happened to coincide with starting to cover homelessness where I was struggling with an insomnia. I was just having trouble sleeping. And it was really hard, but in some ways I was grateful for that, because it gave me more insight into what the folks that, I'm reporting on experience, and that their situation was so much worse. I mean, just imagine never really having a good night's sleep for long extended periods. I'm sure we've all had that. Maybe you've had a sick kid or something that was keeping you from sleeping well for a couple nights in a row. And you just can start to feel yourself degrade. You can feel that, you're kind of operating not on all cylinders, and you're kind of just trying to survive. And these folks really are just trying to survive.
Absolutely.
And so, like, all of these things compound and contribute to sometimes people starting to use substances for them, which are actually, they see reason. And like, for example, I've met so many folks who tell me that they started to use meth because they could stay awake at night. So I've had women tell me that this was a way to stay safe and make sure that they weren't going to get assaulted at night. And then, I've heard stories too of some folks saying, well, not only did it do that, but it also made it so I wasn't as hungry. And so that served a function as well. And so all these things just kind of compound on one another and contribute to more people in the homeless population needing to access resources in our behavioral health system and often struggling to do that.
And it's a downward spiral because when those resources are not available, when those shelter beds don't lead to a safe permanent home and somebody goes back to homelessness, they're more likely to turn to those substances. And that's going to significantly damage their mental health. It's going to create other health challenges. We have recorded more than 100 episodes of this show, Homeless in San Diego. One of the episodes that I'm thinking about, as you were describing the negative effects of sleep deprivation, we recorded with one of our homeless outreach workers who is a mental health clinician. And we'll link to that episode in the show notes because she brings a clinical perspective sharing about the state of mind that individuals are in. And it is, like you said, absolutely survival mode. It is not how you and I are engaging with the world on a regular basis. And it leads to really big problems like just being able to follow through with an appointment or think about not your next meal, but what can we do to secure income for paying for rent next month? Completely alien, not even something that is going to be rational for someone to think about in that situation. So we'll link to that for our listeners who are interested in learning more about that perspective. One other thing, Lisa, that I want to make sure we talk about is that you've done and are doing a lot of work. We're talking about the problems of health challenges and homelessness. You've done a lot of work around the intersection of hospitals and homelessness. What do you want to share on that? And I know you have some stories coming up in the near future that our listeners can read.
Well, I will say this, as we have seen our homeless population grow, hospitals are seeing a lot more homeless San Diegans, and they're really not built to treat this crisis. So hospitals are focused on emergencies, right? You come in, you've got a broken arm. Okay, let's put that in a cast. Make sure that you have a follow-up appointment. Moving on, right? Homelessness is a chronic condition in and of itself. And people who are experiencing homelessness often have a lot of complicated health conditions that are exacerbated by the situations that they are experiencing on the street. And so you see a lot of people cycling through the hospitals again and again and not really being linked with that long-term care that they ultimately need to get past that. And what I'm finding is that, I think a lot of times folks see, I certainly have, people that are maybe wearing a hospital wristband or wearing a hospital gown still, or who just appear to be very fragile on the street. And, we wonder what happened here, right? And so for the past several months, I've been tag teaming with Peggy Petey, an amazing freelance photographer, to try to dig into the stories behind this and what's happening. And what I'm really, hearing a lot about is a lack of quick and easy places for people to go, a lack of an overarching system that says, we have Joe here who's homeless. He is having this ongoing health condition. Let's call somebody. There's no ability to really just call someone and say, Joe's coming out of the hospital here. Where can we send him right now? The hospitals don't have direct referral access to shelters. And, nonprofits like Interfaith do run recuperative care centers, which can be transformative for folks if they're able to get into them. But there's often red tape and other things that keep people from easily going into those facilities. And I'll try to not interview Greg about that right now.
Oh, go for it. Go for it.
But that's, yes, but that is something that's coming up quite a bit is I'm hearing that the hospitals are saying, well, we might like to have more people go into recuperative care, but there are roadblocks to doing that.
We operate Interfaith Community Services, a 106-bed recuperative care center in Escondido. It's a former hotel site that we purchased and almost completely rebuilt. But each room only has 1 to 2 people in it. They're all smaller former hotel rooms. And so individuals get a private, dignified, first-class place to stay, and they're supported by a team of medical nursing staff, behavioral health clinicians, case managers to support them on finding housing, resident behavioral health aides just to support them through their stay. And what we find is that, like you said, it can be in most cases usually is very transformative, Lisa, for those individuals. But we're in Escondido, and you've spent a lot of time talking about homelessness in San Diego, in the city of San Diego, downtown San Diego. A lot of people think of that as an area where a lot of people are unsheltered. There is no standalone recuperative care center like that in that area. There are a couple of programs here and there, but the reality is exactly what you described, that when a hospital has somebody that they would like to move into those programs, the beds either aren't available or they're not in a situation that somebody is able to access quickly. So it's something that we really see as an opportunity to create more of. Are you seeing positive movement towards creating more recuperative care centers, more places for people to go coming out of hospitals?
So there was a recent county supervisor's vote to put $8 million toward creating or building a new recuperative care facility about the same size as yours. And I believe you were asked to consult on that a little bit and provide some insight on how that could work for the county. I am hearing, more leaders talk about the need for places for people who are particularly vulnerable to go, but I'm really not, short of the recent county vote, seeing specific action. And so I think it will be interesting to see, as I have some stories come out that kind of talk about some of the nuances of these challenges. I'm eager to see what some of the responses are to that, because I do think that there's sometimes a lack of understanding, and I run into this a lot, not just with the general public, but even public officials not really understanding, okay, well, you created this thing, but this doesn't quite work. So, for example, a lot of shelters can't take people who have struggles with activities of daily
Absolutely.
living. So say that someone, they can't get in and out of bed on their own. They need help bathing. Maybe they need some assistance eating. These folks often can't get into shelters, but these are also the very folks that I think anyone listening to this podcast would walk by on the street and question why this person's outside.
Yep. Interfaith operated for a number of years a 49-bed congregate shelter, similar to what I described earlier. It was operated out of a large former warehouse space with 24 bunk beds and a single bed. It was 49 based upon some building permit restrictions. That's how we arrived at that figure. And this last summer, we actually had to close that location. There was a huge lack of funding. It used to be, years ago, it was an overnight shelter, and it served a lot of people who were working during the day and needed a place to stay at night, and they just didn't have enough money to pay for rent, and things had happened, and it was, come on in, here's some stability. We'll help you with some job support. We'll help you find a place that you can rent, maybe help with the first month's rent, and off you go. That population is not the population we've served in recent years. Since COVID happened, our former shelter operated 24/7. It just didn't make sense to require people to go out during the day when there were lockdowns in place. And at the same time, we had a dramatic shift in the health challenges of that population. And to your point, Lisa, when we closed that shelter, the individuals within were at greater health risk than the individuals you would see within a hospital, because the people in a hospital are getting 24/7 medical care, and they have adequate, appropriate levels of care and support. Our shelter was not able to provide that, and it was grossly underfunded. So what we did is we reduced the number of beds, and we moved that shelter across the street to our recuperative care center. 80% of the people who were in the shelter, turns out they actually qualified for recuperative care. And so they moved directly into a recuperative care bed that was paid for by their Medi-Cal insurance plan. And so the good news in all of this is that there is increased funding coming through healthcare channels to address individuals, help individuals with healthcare challenges and homelessness. But to your point, Lisa, we haven't yet seen the places to be created where those people can go to access that help. And so to this day, it happens every single day. People are discharged out of hospitals in hospital gowns to homelessness, not even to shelters, because those shelters, to your point, aren't able to care for their needs. It's a really very sad situation.
Well, and one thing I want to underscore here is, that because, or rather emphasize, is because I know people are in the background here thinking, well, wasn't there that 2019 or 2018 state law that said that the hospitals can't discharge people without shelter? That was SB 1152, and it went into effect in 2019, just before COVID. And basically, it did say that when hospitals are discharging homeless people, they need to prioritize trying to get them into shelter, and to provide food and clothing and other things that they might need, and to document that. However, to your point, it did not supply new funding, and therefore has not supplied new places for people to go. Now, there have been some programs that have expanded, but really there's nothing to meet the current volume of people coming out of shelters, or coming out of hospitals rather, to go into shelter. So you're continuing to see these situations where people are discharged to homelessness.
Yeah, we are absolutely. And the alternative, the creation of places where people can go, is a really positive thing. And I want us to, as we move into the last part of the podcast here, really, I don't want listeners to come away with just all this doom and gloom stuff. I mean, things are really challenging, but there are bright spots, and there are things that our listeners can do. There are things that all of us can do. And advocating and being supportive of centers that help individuals coming out of hospitals is one of those things. The hotel that Interfaith purchased, it used to be I'm like to do air quotes, like a budget hotel, that was basically just a hotspot for criminal activity. After we purchased it, the only people who were coming around were drug dealers looking for where their clients had gone. And since we purchased it, also during COVID, the calls to police, the calls for service from that location have dropped nearly 90%. And the location that's been developed is a really amazingly better place for our community, putting aside the transformation that's happening for the individuals within. So I would offer to our listeners that we can advocate and demand that we create more places for people to go. And these places can be really bright spots in our communities. They're not anything that's going to be a negative thing or something we would push back in our community.
And I think it's important, too, to note that, as we talked about before, the population is increasingly vulnerable. Yeah. And I think that that's really important for listeners to be aware of as well. I mean, we're talking about more people who are, 55 plus on our streets, more people who have serious health conditions and disabilities on the street. And that is only going to continue to grow from every, data point that we have. And so, in my own reporting, I'm really focused on trying to better understand and explain what our system needs to try to serve these folks who, as I said before, anybody listening to this podcast, you'd walk by some of these folks on the street and you would say, why is this person out here? Surely there has to be a better place. But often there's not right now. There's not a better place. And so, I think it's incumbent on all of us, and my role as a reporter is to help, identify challenges so hopefully we can address them, right? But to really understand that and try to advocate from our own positions, whether that's as a journalist just explaining it, or if you as an individual want to see us better serve and this population and provide places for them to go, well, Greg can tell you what to do
Well,
there.
and you do a lot of reporting within the city of San Diego, which has created a lot of shelter beds in recent years. A lot of populations, it doesn't work for everybody, right? But it works for some. We work at Interfaith Community Services, largely in North San Diego County, where the shelter landscape is dramatically different. And where there are thousands of shelter beds in San Diego, there are a couple hundred shelter beds in North San Diego. But we are seeing some positive developments. The city of Oceanside has opened a navigation center operated by the San Diego Rescue Mission. The city of Vista is just opening a shelter, a joint venture with funding from Vista and City of Encinitas, and they're contracting with another community-based organization on that resource. And these don't end homelessness. Getting out of the shelter is a whole other challenge in and of itself. But they're better than nothing, and they're better than what we have now. And they are a short-term place for people to go. We at Interfaith certainly see the opportunity to create more recuperative care that, like our center, also has some shelter beds to access as a pathway into those programs and other resources as a sustainable model. And then I would encourage our listeners to consider, we have an election coming up in the state of California. Prop 1 on the ballot is going to provide additional funding that already exists, that right now it's sometimes called the millionaire's tax. So this is money earned above $1 million annually. Every Californian pays it. Right now, 95% of that tax money that's collected goes to counties to provide behavioral health services. Prop 1 takes 5% more of that and keeps it at the state level to pay for a bond that's going to be used to address what Lisa and I have been talking about for the last half an hour, and that's to create more places for people to go, more behavioral health beds, more treatment beds, more places for people to go. At Interfaith Community Services, we fully support Prop 1 and this initiative to take existing dollars and use them to create more places. And it's definitely an action item for listeners to consider. Look into it, do your own research, but it is something that can be done to address the challenge that Lisa and I have spent a lot of time talking about. Lisa, I want to provide you opportunity to share about other positives, other opportunities that you see ahead. We always have a call to action here on the podcast, other things that you would encourage listeners who are passionate about helping people overcome these challenges. Other things you might recommend for them to consider.
Well, this always sounds very Pollyanna when I say it, but it's true. And that is, I think just when you're walking down the street and you encounter somebody who is homeless, acknowledge them just like you would any other person. Maybe even smile and just say, "Hey, how are you today?" Or just a little hi, or even just a nod. Sometimes people who are homeless, they'll go literally days without anyone acknowledging them. And that really does not help when it comes to them getting out of that situation. I mean, we can all imagine and have probably gone through periods where we felt lonely and know how hard that can be. This is on steroids. When you're homeless, you can feel like nobody sees me, nobody sees my humanity. People often tell me that people treat them like animals or pests. And so that little bit of acknowledgement can go so far. And if you feel comfortable, maybe you see somebody every day, maybe start up a conversation with that person, get to know them. Sometimes just those little social contacts can mean so much. And I think about a story, Peggy Petey, amazing photographer. We should put a link to her work on this in the show notes. But Peggy had done a blog on a man named Moses. And Moses talked about how he was going through a really tough time. And he was thinking, I can't go on anymore. And somebody smiled at him. And it made all the difference. So that does, like, when I say it, I always feel like it sounds really Pollyanna. I probably would have made fun of myself saying that 15 years ago. But I've found just being out on the street how much that can mean. And it doesn't cost anything.
Everybody can do it. And we've recorded 100 plus of episodes of this show. We ask every guest, what can people do? People who have experienced homelessness, people who work in and around homelessness. And Lisa, almost every single person has given some version of the answer you just shared. It is. And And not only is mental health, not only is homelessness bad for your mental health, but hundreds and hundreds of people die on the streets every year. Last year, almost 600 people died on the streets in San Diego while experiencing homelessness, and a lot of those individuals were deaths by suicide. And so giving up hope, and it happens far too often. So the power of all of us to connect with each other and support one another in times of crisis is something that we should all always remember, because we can all take that step. Lisa, you and I wonder, I was thinking about this getting ready for the show today. Like, I wondered how many hours have we spent with you interviewing me. I've never interviewed you before, so this is kind of interesting. But like, how many hours have we spent over the years? I don't know. It's a lot. Um, I don't feel like I've done you any service today. Like, I'm not asking as good of questions as I'm sure you would have asked me. So, what else would you like to share with our listeners? And do you have any questions for me before we wrap up today? Okay. Well, first, I think it's important, because we're talking about the humanity, to understand that I believe the vilifying of people experiencing homelessness, vilifying people who are having mental health challenges, vilifying people who are struggling with addiction, is going to increase significantly in the years ahead. We've already seen progressive politicians who were very focused on the humanity of the issue swing to a point where they're calling for enforcement, they're calling for taking away individuals' rights and forcing them into things, forcing them into to accept resources that, frankly, behavioral health resources that don't exist, that aren't accessible right now. So I think we need to understand that and anticipate that there will be more challenges ahead. And there's going to be a real battle for the humanity of individuals who are being victimized, and who are disenfranchised and on the streets. And so, again, none of us have a magic wand, and most of us don't have $1 billion, but all of us have the ability to try to change hearts and minds. And we all are part of communities. We all, and more of us, are talking about homelessness. We can all stand up and speak up for those individuals who often are not able to, because they're on the streets in a really horrible situation. So I'll start the hypothetical question with a very practical answer. We can all speak to the humanity, and counter some of the negativity that's out there, and there's going to be more coming. Um, and then, in terms of like the actual stuff, if we had the resources to create it, it would be housing. Um, we're going to create more recuperative care centers. We're going to create more short-term places for people to go. There's more healthcare funding coming that will support that, thankfully. I think as the issue gets greater, becomes more visible, despite the vilification that is happening and is going to increase, I do think people are caring and want to make a difference, and are going to demand that our government at all levels do more to help. So I do think there will be more investment, philanthropically and through tax dollars, to create those places. But none of it matters if we don't have housing that people can afford. And that comes down to housing of all types. It comes down to the challenges in our rental market. We have moms in our family homeless shelter who earn a fine living and are doing a great job raising their kids and have enough money to pay the rent. They just can't find a landlord who will say yes to them, because their application doesn't rise to the top. So we need to create more places for people like that there to go. What I'll put the question back to you, Lisa. You're very much an expert in this area after your years of reporting. So what would you like to see happen that would help address some of the systemic challenges that you've done such a great job reporting on?
I think there's a need for more permanent supportive housing with more supports. I think we're seeing people that have more needs, seniors who might need care aides to help them with day-to-day activities, people dealing with substance use disorder who might need some more support, but certainly, do need housing. I'm also just in the new year thinking a lot about SB 43 implementation, and I'll say what that is very quickly, because I think we've been talking around the edges of this reform and what it will mean. So the state is effective technically this January 1st. The state has a new conservatorship law that expanded who can be conserved or held for a short-term period of up to 72 hours. That now doesn't just include people with mental health conditions, but also with severe substance use disorder. And so that dramatically increases the number of people who could be coming into local hospitals, at least on a short-term hold for evaluation. And for this to succeed in actually getting people care after these short-term holds, there need to be places for them to go. But right now, as Greg has talked about, often people who want substance use treatment, whether that's, detox or residential treatment, both of which Interfaith offers, really struggle to get that. It's often not available on demand. And these are people that want that care. These are people that are seeking it out desperately. I've literally had people sobbing on the phone with me wanting to get a detox bed who are waiting weeks for one. And with this new law will also allow then is for involuntary holds, obviously, for people that have severe substance use disorders. We don't have involuntary treatment options for substance use disorder in San Diego now. So the county has decided to postpone implementation possibly up until the new year, start of the new year. But there's a lot of work to do before that. And there's a lot of, discussion that's playing out early this year about what sorts of different treatment we need to offer. I know the county's looking at locked treatment options, but there's a lot of work to be done. So that's something I'm definitely watching closely this year.
Well, Lisa, thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking time out of your reporting duties to share just a little bit of the wisdom that you've learned in your time covering homelessness. I will encourage our listeners to check out Lisa's work. You can go to the Voice of San Diego and see her articles. There are articles coming up in the weeks ahead on the intersection between hospitals and homelessness that we've spent so much time discussing. And we will also link in our show notes to a couple of the articles that we think are relevant to what Lisa shared. We'll also link, as I mentioned, to the episode with Jen Halverstadt, our mental health clinician who does homeless outreach, and her insights on the challenges, the mental health challenges, and where people's heads are at when they're experiencing these issues. Very relevant to what we shared about today. And Lisa, I think this is the first time you've been on the podcast.
Yes, we've talked about it so many
I can't believe
times,
it.
and it's been my fault. I've always had like some kind of breaking news or something going on.
Well, I really
so glad to finally make it happen.
I really, really, really hope it will not be the last. Would love to have you on in the future on other topics. Anything else you want to share with our listeners before we wrap up today, Lisa?
Just support local journalism. I think journalism is really important in terms of, helping the community understand what it can do to address these big challenges like homelessness and our behavioral health crisis. So, my industry is struggling. We have a lot of, unfortunately, people losing their jobs. And I just think it's important to support journalism and pay for it to ensure that this work can continue. And I think it's important for the community to recognize that you would not have a lot of information if not for us demanding it and demanding answers often from local officials about what they are and aren't doing to tackle issues like homelessness.
Yeah, 100%. Support local journalism, support the Voice of San Diego. Their articles are almost entirely free of charge. but you can join me in being a member and donating. It's always a nice way to support other local journalism. We're wrapping up today. I want to give a shout out to our communications guru, Logan Government, who's helped get the audio and the video today. Logan, did I miss anything that we were supposed to talk about? We got it. All right. Well, Lisa, thank you again for joining us. Good to see you at the Voice of San Diego studio. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Excited to have you back for season 4. More to come in the weeks and months ahead. Lisa, thank you so much.
Thank you. And shout out to Nate John at Voice of San Diego for helping me get set up.
Nate John, I miss you, bud. Good to see you. And thanks for helping out. And thanks for the good work that you all do there at the Voice of San Diego. All right. Have a great day, everyone.